So, let's talk about the Israel-Arab conflict. And yes, I can already feel some of you tensing up, maybe reaching for the remote, thinking, oh God, not this again, it's complicated, it's messy, it feels like it's been going on forever, which to be fair is not entirely wrong. But stick with me because understanding this is important. It's a story that's constantly on the news, shaping global politics, affecting millions of real, actual human beings. And if we're going to have any opinion on it, which let's be honest, many of us do, we should probably know what we're actually talking about. This isn't just some distant problem, it has a way of reaching everywhere. The story begins with a piece of land, a very, very small piece of land. Seriously, we're talking about an area roughly the size of New Jersey. You could drive across it in a few hours if you didn't hit traffic or, a geopolitical crisis. This tiny strip of territory is nestled in the Middle East, along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. For something so small, it has a ridiculously oversized importance. It's a place that has been conquered, reconquered, and fought over for thousands of years. Romans, Ottomans. It's like the last slice of pizza at a party that everyone desperately wants. Why all the fuss? Well, for one, it's considered holy to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For Jews, it is the Promised Land, the ancient kingdom of Israel, with Jerusalem as its sacred capital. For Christians, it's where Jesus lived, Jesus preached, and Jesus was crucified. And for Muslims, it's where the Prophet Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven. When you have that many people calling a place holy, you're basically setting up the world's most intense homeowners association meeting, where the rules were written thousands of years ago and everyone disagrees on the interpretation. This convergence of faith makes the land incredibly significant, but it's not just about religion. It's also about identity, culture, and a sense of belonging. It's about history and memory. For centuries, this place was known as Palestine, a region inhabited by a diverse population, predominantly Arab. But it was also the ancestral homeland for Jewish people, who maintained a continuous, albeit small presence there even after being scattered across the globe. This sets the stage for our story. A tale of two peoples, both with deep, legitimate ties to the same small patch of earth. And as you can imagine, that's where things start to get complicated. Before we dive into the wars and the headlines, we need to meet the main characters in this drama. On one side, we have the Jewish people. For nearly 2,000 years, after the Romans destroyed their temple and scattered them, most Jews lived in diaspora, spread out all over the world. Europe, the Middle East, North Africa. They often lived as minorities, frequently faced persecution, culminating in the unimaginable horror of the Holocaust. Throughout this time, the dream of returning to Zion, their ancestral homeland, remained central to their identity. It was a prayer, a hope, and a political movement. That movement was called Zionism. By the late 19th century, it became a formal political goal. European Jews, facing rising anti-Semitism, argued the only way to be safe was a country of their own. Jewish immigrants, fueled by this idea and fleeing persecution, began moving to Palestine. They bought land, built communities, and laid foundations for a future nation. On the other side, we have the Palestinian Arabs. They were the people already living there. By the early 20th century, the population was overwhelmingly Arab, Muslim, Christian. They had their own culture, their own society, and a sense of identity tied to the land where their families had lived for generations. To them, this wasn't empty territory. It was their home. They saw the influx of Jewish immigrants not as a homecoming, but as a colonial project. They worried it threatened their way of life, threatened their land, and threatened their aspirations for independence. Imagine you've lived in a house your whole life. Then distant relatives of the person who built it 2,000 years ago show up with blueprints, saying they're moving back in based on a deep historical claim. You can see how that might cause friction. Both groups, Jews and Arabs, saw themselves as rightful inhabitants. Both had dreams of self-determination, and both were looking at the exact same piece of real estate to make those dreams real. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was a fundamental clash of two national movements over one small, sacred, and intensely coveted homeland. So, how did this simmering tension explode into a global headline? Well, for that, we need to introduce a new character, the British Empire. Because if there's one thing the British were good at in the early 20th century, it was showing up in places they weren't invited and making things exquisitely more complicated. During World War I, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. The British essentially told the Arabs, hey, help us fight the Ottomans and we'll help you get your own independent state after the war. The Arabs said, you've got a deal. But here's where the plot thickens. While they were whispering sweet nothings about independence to the Arabs, they were also having a quiet chat with the Zionists. In 1917, Arthur Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration. It declared that the British government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It's like promising two different friends they can have your apartment after you move out. It's a strategy guaranteed to end with screaming, broken friendships. The declaration did include a little caveat, but for the Arabs who made up 90% of the population, that felt less like a guarantee and more like an afterthought scribbled on a napkin. After World War I ended, the Ottoman Empire was carved up. The newly formed League of Nations gave Britain a mandate to govern Palestine. The official goal was to help prepare the locals for self-rule. But in reality, the British were now stuck trying to manage the conflicting promises they had made. Under British rule, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased significantly. The Jewish community, or the Yishuv, began to build the institutions of a state-in-waiting. They were, quite effectively, building their home, brick by brick. For the Palestinian Arabs, this period was one of growing alarm and dispossession. They watched as their demographic majority began to shrink and saw land their families had farmed for generations being sold out from under them. This created a volatile cycle of tension and violence. In 1929, disputes over access to the Western Wall exploded into widespread riots that left over 200 Jews and Arabs dead. The British, caught in the middle of their own mess, responded with police actions, commissions of inquiry, and reports that tried to placate one side without angering the other. A political tightrope walk that satisfied absolutely no one. By the mid-1930s, the situation had gone from bad to worse. The Palestinians launched a full-scale uprising known as the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. This wasn't just a riot, it was a sustained, organized national rebellion. The British response was brutal. To crush the rebellion, they brought in tens of thousands of troops. They imposed harsh collective punishments, conducted mass arrests, and demolished homes. By the time the revolt was suppressed, thousands of Palestinians had been killed, their leadership was left decimated. The rebellion had failed to achieve its goals, but it had succeeded in hardening the lines between the two communities. In a classic case of too little too late, the British did a complete U-turn. In 1939 they issued a policy document called the White Paper. It basically sided with the Arabs, severely restricting Jewish immigration, and restricted the sale of land to Jews. The Arabs rejected it, and the Zionists were horrified. It was a betrayal of the Balfour Declaration, and the timing could not have been worse. This was 1939. The doors to Palestine were being slammed shut at the exact moment that the Jews of Europe were facing extermination. The White Paper turned the Jewish community in Palestine against the British. Jewish paramilitary groups now began to actively work against them, smuggling in illegal immigrants and carrying out attacks on British infrastructure. By the end of World War II, Britain had lost control. Both sides hated them, and the land was a powder keg waiting for a match. So World War II ends. The full horror of the Holocaust is revealed, and the argument for a Jewish state gains a horrifying new urgency. 6 million Jews had been murdered. Hundreds of thousands of survivors were now displaced. Jewish paramilitary groups in Palestine ramped up their fight against the British. They bombed bridges, railways, and most famously, the King David Hotel. Their message was loud and clear: get out. The final straw for the British was an incident involving a ship called the Exodus 1947. This rickety old steamboat was packed with over 4,500 Holocaust survivors trying to reach Palestine. The British Royal Navy intercepted it, and in a public relations disaster of epic proportions, forced the refugees back onto ships bound for camps in Germany. Yes, you read that right. They sent Holocaust survivors back to Germany. Faced with mounting violence, international condemnation, the British did what any overwhelmed empire would do. They gave up. In early 1947 they announced they were handing the whole mess over to the newly formed United Nations. So, the problem lands on the lap of the United Nations. The UN formed a special committee, UNSCOP, to figure out what to do with Palestine. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted on Resolution 181, better known as the Partition Plan. The idea was to slice Palestine into two states, one for the Jews, one for the Arabs. Jerusalem would be an international city. The Jewish community in Palestine was ecstatic. The plan gave them the one thing they craved most: international legitimacy for a state of their own, but the Arab world's reaction was the complete opposite. They rejected the plan outright, viewing it as a catastrophic injustice. To them, the UN had no right to give away the majority of their homeland to a minority of immigrant settlers. The Arab League declared the plan illegal and promised to prevent its implementation by force. The stage was now set not for a peaceful partition, but for war. The moment the United Nations voted for partition, the simmering violence in Palestine boiled over into a full-blown civil war. Amidst all this chaos, on May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The celebration was short-lived. The very next day, Egypt invaded, Jordan invaded, Syria invaded, Lebanon invaded, Iraq invaded. This marked the beginning of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, or what Israelis call the War of Independence. They gradually managed to turn the tide of the war. By the time the fighting stopped in 1949, the map looked very different. Israel had not only survived, but it now controlled 77% of the land. The Arab state envisioned by the United Nations never came into being. For Israelis, it was a miraculous victory. For Palestinians, it was the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Over 700,000 Palestinians had either fled or were expelled from their homes, becoming refugees in neighboring lands. So, after the 1948 war, things did not exactly calm down. You had a tense, angry standoff. And in 1956, it got won. Egypt's charismatic new leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, responded by nationalizing the Suez Canal, seizing it from the British and French companies that controlled it. So they cooked up a secret plan: get Israel to attack Egypt, giving them the perfect excuse to swoop in. The United States was furious and ordered them all to get out. The invasion collapsed. Fast forward to 1967, the tensions were even higher. The Arab world was full of fiery rhetoric about wiping Israel off the map. Israel, feeling its existence was once again under threat, decided to act first. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a stunning preemptive airstrike that destroyed almost the entire Egyptian Air Force on the ground. It was a devastating opening blow, and it kicked off what became known as the Six-Day War. In just 6 days, Israel achieved a victory so total it shocked everyone. They captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The results of the Six-Day War were world-changing. Israel was now the military occupier of over 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. This occupation would become the new focal point of the conflict. Arab states, humiliated, responded with the famous three no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. On October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, Egypt launched a surprise attack. Syria launched a surprise attack. The Israeli army, caught off guard, was initially overwhelmed. The Yom Kippur War was brutal and costly. After the shock, Israel mobilized its reserves and pushed back the invading armies. In 1977, Anwar Sadat did the unthinkable. He flew to Jerusalem. He spoke before the Israeli parliament, offering peace. Negotiations followed. In 1978, Sadat and Menachem Begin signed the Camp David Accords. A year later they signed a formal peace treaty. It was the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab country, a landmark achievement but costly. Sadat was assassinated in 1981 by extremists who saw him as a traitor. For 20 years, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza had been living under Israeli military rule. In December 1987, it finally exploded. It ignited a massive, spontaneous uprising. The First Intifada, most enduring image, Palestinian youths throwing stones, heavily armed Israeli soldiers, TV images, a PR disaster for Israel. Global sympathy shifted toward Palestinians. The Intifada changed the conflict's dynamics. In 1988, Arafat renounced terrorism and recognized Israel's right to exist. A glimmer of hope, secret talks in Norway, led to a breakthrough. The handshake, unimaginable a year before. For a brief shining moment, peace felt within reach. But on the ground, it didn't feel like peace. For many Palestinians, the occupation didn't end. Jewish settlers on the ground increased dramatically. Extremists on both sides tried to sabotage the process. Palestinian militant groups, particularly Hamas, launched a campaign of suicide bombings in Israeli cities. Hundreds of Israeli civilians were killed. Then, in November 1995, optimism suffered its final blow. A right-wing Israeli extremist assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin at a peace rally in Tel Aviv. US President Bill Clinton, in a last-ditch effort, brought the leaders to Camp David. Barak made an offer that went further than any Israeli leader before him. But for Arafat, it just wasn't enough. Arafat rejected the deal and walked away. A few months later, the powder keg finally ignited. The trigger was a visit by Ariel Sharon to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. His visit was seen by Palestinians as a deliberate provocation. This lit the fuse for the Second Intifada, a far bloodier and more militarized uprising than the first. The fighting raged for nearly 5 years, leaving over 3,000 Palestinians and about 1,000 Israelis dead. In response to the suicide bombings, Israel began building a massive and highly controversial structure, the West Bank barrier. Israel called it a security fence, but Palestinians called it an apartheid wall. For Palestinians, it became a towering concrete symbol of the occupation, splintering their communities and making the dream of a viable, contiguous state seem, well, physically impossible. By 2005, Ariel Sharon did something that shocked everyone. He decided that holding on to the Gaza Strip was a strategic nightmare, and proposed a disengagement plan. The evacuation in the summer of 2005 was a traumatic national event. Scenes of soldiers forcibly dragging weeping settlers from their homes were broadcast around the world. The Israeli withdrawal left a power vacuum in Gaza. In the 2006 Palestinian legislative elections, Hamas won a shocking landslide victory. The international community refused to deal with a government they considered a terrorist organization. This led to a short, brutal civil war in 2007. Hamas won, violently seizing complete control of the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian national movement was now broken in two. The situation today can best be described as a grim, exhausting stalemate. For Palestinians in the West Bank, life is a daily struggle under military occupation, making a contiguous, viable state look like Swiss cheese. In Gaza, the situation is even more dire. Since the Hamas takeover, Israel and Egypt have imposed a strict blockade. It's a pressure cooker with the lid screwed on tight. For Israelis, the primary concern is security. The rise of Hamas in Gaza and the influence of Hezbollah in Lebanon mean hostile, well-armed groups sit on their borders. The cycle of violence continues with depressing regularity. Periodically tensions explode, especially around Gaza. Militant groups fire rockets into Israel. Israel responds with devastating airstrikes and operations. 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, 2023, these rounds result in thousands of deaths, mostly Palestinian. Each round deepens hatred and trauma, making reconciliation more distant. This isn't just a dispute over land, it's a clash of two powerful, deeply held narratives. For most Israelis, this is a story about the return of a persecuted people to their ancestral homeland, a story of survival against all odds. For Palestinians, the story is completely different. It's a narrative of dispossession and injustice. They see themselves as the indigenous people of the land, who were displaced and colonized. These two narratives are like two trains speeding toward each other on the same track. Acknowledging the truth in the other's story feels like betraying your own. This is the core of the deadlock, and that is why understanding this history is so important. It doesn't mean you have to pick a side, but it does mean recognizing that this isn't a simple story of good guys and bad guys. It is a tragedy, a clash of right against right. Without understanding the fears, the traumas, and the historical narratives that drive both Israelis and Palestinians, we are left with nothing but angry headlines and uninformed opinions. And that has never ever helped anyone.